The house sat quietly off the narrow road outside San Diego, low-slung, cedar-sided, with a porch that caught the evening sun in amber streaks. It was where Jim Croce and his wife Ingrid had lived in the early 1970s, before the crash that ended his life in 1973. Locals said it had been rented out for years, but no one stayed long. The story began when Thomas and Laura Miles bought the property in early spring. They were musicians themselves, drawn by the romantic idea of owning a piece of American folk history. The realtor mentioned the connection casually, Croce wrote time in a bottle here, but stopped short of elaborating on why the price was unusually low. Within the first week, the couple noticed oddities. Every night, at roughly 1:14 a.m., the time the plane carrying Croce went down in Louisiana, a faint hum filled the living room. It wasn't a mechanical noise. Laura described it as a voice trying to catch a melody. The sound drifted between walls, never quite distinct enough to record. Neighbors mentioned that, in the 1990s, a young songwriter named Evan had rented the place and left abruptly. When Thomas asked if anyone knew why, an older woman at the nearby gas station said he thought someone was finishing his songs for him. Then she looked away, embarrassed at her own words. One night, Thomas set up microphones in the studio room, an old converted guest house where Jim had once recorded demos. The room still smelled faintly of pine and cigarette smoke. When they played the tapes back, they heard a barely audible guitar progression, 3 descending notes that neither of them had played. By midsummer, Laura began waking up to find the studio light on. Once, she found a single sheet of paper on the old upright piano, staff lines drawn by hand, the ink fresh, as though someone had just begun composing. The first note spelled out a pattern she recognized, the opening phrase of "I got a name." Curiosity turned into quiet dread. They researched the plane crash, reading about Croce's last concert at Northwestern State University and how he'd written to his wife the night before, saying he wanted to quit touring and go home. The letter ended with, "I'll see you soon." Thomas kept insisting there was a rational explanation. Faulty wiring, air pressure, echoes from the highway. But Laura began hearing footsteps in the gravel outside, followed by the sound of someone quietly strumming. When she opened the door, there was only the empty porch and the wind brushing through the trees. The final proof came one rain-heavy night in October. Thomas sat in the studio, strumming an old Gibson he'd bought at auction. The air felt dense, the way it does before a storm. He hit a wrong chord and muttered, "Sorry," out loud. From the opposite corner of the room came the faint, warm reply of another guitar string, perfectly tuned, perfectly timed. Laura, standing by the doorway, whispered, "Jim," and for a moment, both of them swore they heard it, a man's soft humming, like someone lost in thought, trying to remember the next line of a song he never got to finish. Outside, the wind rattled the porch swing, and the house fell silent again, keeping its quiet rhythm of memory and music. The days in the old cedar house began to feel longer, stretched by the silence that seemed to hum faintly between the walls. Laura started leaving the studio light on at night, not out of fear, she told herself, but to make the place feel lived in. Yet every morning, without fail, it would be off again. The cord would be neatly coiled beside the outlet. Once, the door to the studio, always left open, was closed from the inside. Thomas had stopped trying to explain everything. He still called himself a rational man, but his logic had softened into silence. There were too many things he couldn't account for: the whispering notes, the phantom strings that seemed to echo him like a quiet duet. Even the air in the studio carried a faint trace of warmth, as if someone had been there minutes earlier, humming to himself, tuning an unseen guitar. It was early September when Laura noticed something else. The scent of tobacco. Not the modern, chemical kind, but that thick, woody sweetness of pipe smoke, the kind Jim Croce was said to have favored during late-night writing sessions. The smell came suddenly, without warning, filling the hallway that led to the studio. It lingered for a few moments, then drifted away. That same night, Thomas sat by the porch, guitar in his lap, eyes unfocused. The darkness around the house wasn't heavy, more like a quiet blanket over the land, but he felt watched. He plucked a few soft notes, something that vaguely resembled photographs and memories. From somewhere deep inside the house, another string answered, fragile but perfectly in tune. He stopped playing. The reply stopped too. Inside, Laura stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. She had heard it as well. The next morning, Thomas found a small box resting on the piano bench. It hadn't been there before. The box was old, wooden, with initials carved faintly into the lid JC. Inside, wrapped in a thin piece of yellowed cloth, was a broken harmonica reed and a short strip of faded tape. There was no dust on it, as though it had just been placed there. He played the tape using their old recorder. Static filled the room, and then a few seconds of muffled guitar followed by a man's voice, distant but familiar. Maybe if I slow it down, yeah, that's better. Thomas froze. The voice was unmistakably Croce's. He had listened to those old recordings hundreds of times, but this one wasn't part of any official collection. That evening, Laura couldn't bring herself to enter the studio. The once inspiring space now felt like a sealed chamber, humming with invisible presence. She sat by the window instead, watching the long line of orange light fade behind the trees. In the distance, she heard what sounded like an engine stalling, a sputter followed by silence like a small plane struggling against the air. She blinked, and it was gone. Sleep came slowly. The night pressed against the house, heavy with crickets and wind. At 1:14 a.m., the sound returned, not humming this time, but something more deliberate. It was music, low and hesitant, as though someone were relearning a forgotten melody. Laura walked barefoot down the hall, each step quiet against the wooden floor. The studio door was ajar, the light flickering faintly through the crack. Inside, the piano keys moved just slightly as if brushed by air. Thomas entered behind her, whispering her name. Together they stood in the doorway, listening. The melody was clear now, operator, played slowly, tenderly, like someone remembering his own story. The temperature dropped. The smell of tobacco deepened. And then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. When Thomas stepped forward, the air shifted. A faint figure, a suggestion more than a shape, seemed to stand by the piano. Not frightening, not even distinct, but human. The outline of a man leaning slightly, head bowed in concentration. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Laura turned toward Thomas, her voice trembling but calm. "He's still writing," she said. "He never finished." Outside, a storm was gathering. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and distant smoke. From the open window, a single note escaped, soft, yearning, incomplete. It hung in the night air, unanswered. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. For the next few days, Thomas and Laura moved through the house as if walking inside someone else's memory. Every sound, every creak in the floorboards seemed amplified. The air carried an invisible charge, like static waiting for a touch. They tried to return to their normal rhythm: morning coffee on the porch, quiet dinners, occasional music, but the house no longer felt neutral, felt aware. One afternoon, Laura decided to organize the attic. Dust hung in the air like gauze, catching the sunlight that bled through narrow gaps in the wood. She found boxes of forgotten things, broken photo frames, letters from the 1980s, a few vinyl records warped by heat. Near the back wall, beneath a tarp, was an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. It looked almost identical to the one Jim had used in studio photos. She brought it downstairs and set it on the piano bench. The reels were still in place. A strip of masking tape marked across the spool read, in faded handwriting, "September 19th, last take." That date made her throat tighten. September 20th, 1973, had been the crash. This was the night before. Thomas came in as she pressed play. The tape hissed, sputtered, and then began Jim's unmistakable baritone humming the intro to a song neither of them recognized. It was unfinished, fragments of lyrics mumbled between chords. Then came a pause, followed by a faint, almost weary chuckle. "Maybe when I get back," the voice said, and the tape cut off with a snap. Laura turned it off immediately. The sound had filled the entire house like a ghost exhaling. For several minutes, they sat in silence, the ticking of the clock the only sound. That night, rain came hard and sudden, drumming against the roof. Power flickered twice before holding steady. Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the tape's last words. Maybe when I get back. She got up around 2 and walked down the hallway barefoot, the floor cool beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe with her, wood expanding, contracting, whispering. She reached the studio door and saw light glowing faintly from inside, even though she'd unplugged everything hours earlier. Through the crack, she could see the piano. Its keys moved gently, not in melody this time but in slow, wandering presses, like fingers testing the distance between notes. Laura pushed the door open softly. The light dimmed. The air grew dense, warm with that same faint pipe tobacco scent. She whispered, barely audible, "Jim." The only reply was a single key being pressed, middle C, held for several seconds before fading into nothing. Thomas found her there an hour later, sitting on the piano bench, her hand resting on the lid as if comforting someone invisible. She didn't speak when he touched her shoulder, only said finally, "He's lonely." Over the next week, they noticed the studio subtly rearranging itself. The microphone stand they had stored in the closet reappeared beside the piano. The harmonica box was now on the window ledge, open. Once, Thomas returned home to find the guitar case unlatched, its strings freshly tuned. They brought in a sound engineer friend from Los Angeles, someone familiar with analog setups. His name was Eddie, a practical man who laughed off ghost stories. He spent the afternoon wiring recorders, saying, "Whatever this is, we'll capture it." But that night, when the clock hit 1:14, the room filled again with that fragile melody guitar and voice woven together in impossible synchronization. Eddie's eyes went wide as he watched the recording level spike. Then came a faint whisper through the monitor, "Home." The next morning, he left without breakfast, muttering, "That wasn't feedback." Thomas played the tape again later. The word "home" was clear, tender, filled with a kind of ache that cut through time. He stared at the waveform on the laptop screen, knowing logic couldn't explain it. The frequency wasn't human, but it wasn't noise either. It sat somewhere between. That evening, Laura walked out to the porch just as the sun lowered behind the hills. The air smelled of rain and old wood. From inside the house came the faintest guitar strum, soft, nostalgic, deliberate. She turned her head slightly, eyes wet, and whispered, "You can rest now, Jim." The wind carried her voice away. The music didn't stop. It only grew quieter, as though retreating deeper into the walls, settling into its old rhythm, unfinished, unforgotten, waiting. The final weeks in the house passed like a dream that refused to wake. The lines between sound and silence, memory and presence, had blurred so deeply that Thomas and Laura moved through each day with the reverence of people visiting a sacred place. They no longer questioned what was happening. They listened. The air itself seemed to hum with a low, constant warmth, as if the walls remembered laughter. The studio had become the heart of the house, alive, pulsing faintly, like an instrument waiting for a hand. The scent of old tobacco still drifted in now and then, always when the hour crept near 1 in the morning. One late night, Thomas sat alone in that room, recording. He had been trying for days to finish a song, something simple, a waltz built around the idea of unfinished stories. Laura had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in one of his sweaters. Outside, the wind brushed through the cedar trees like someone softly dragging fingers through hair. He pressed record and began to play. The first chords came out hesitant, shaky. He muttered, half to himself, "This isn't right." Then, as if answering, a second guitar joined him. It was faint but unmistakable fingerpicking in perfect counterpoint, lifting his melody with something older, wiser, heart-breakingly tender. Thomas froze for a moment, his breath catching. Then, instead of stopping, he kept playing. He let the unseen hands guide him. The two guitars danced, his and the one that came from nowhere, weaving around each other until the final note rang clear and held. The recorder clicked off on its own. The room went silent again, save for the soft creak of the wood. Thomas sat there a long time, his fingers still poised over the strings, eyes stinging. When he finally stood, the light over the piano flickered once and went out completely. In the morning, Laura found him asleep in the chair, the guitar resting against his leg. He looked peaceful, almost boyish. On the table beside him lay a sheet of music that hadn't been there before, handwritten in dark ink, the paper slightly aged. The melody was simple but perfect, with the initials JC scrawled at the bottom corner. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Laura pressed her hand over her mouth, whispering, "He finished it." That afternoon, they drove into town and found a small music shop on the corner of Main and Vine. Thomas bought a reel of blank tape and asked the owner, an old man with kind eyes, if he could transfer a recording onto vinyl. When the man asked what kind of music it was, Thomas smiled faintly. "Something that's been waiting 50 years. Took 2 days." When they returned to pick it up, the old man held the record carefully, like something fragile. "Beautiful work," he said. "You sure this isn't a lost Croce track? Sounds just like him." They didn't answer. They took the record home, placed it on the turntable, and listened as the room filled once more with that quiet, bittersweet sound. A blend of Thomas's voice and another woven underneath it, older, raspier, but warm. It wasn't eerie anymore. Felt like goodbye. That night, the air in the house shifted. The faint smell of tobacco returned one last time, sweeter than before. The clock ticked past 1:14, but no music played. No strings hummed. Only silence, and in that silence, a strange peace. Laura stepped outside just before dawn. The horizon was pale blue, and the world was still. The porch swing rocked gently, though the air was calm. On it sat the harmonica box, closed. For the first time, it was covered in a thin layer of dust. When Thomas joined her, she took his hand and said softly, "He's gone home." They stayed a few more months before selling the house. The next owners, a young couple from Los Angeles, never reported anything unusual. No late-night music, no drifting smoke, no flickering lights. To them, it was just an old, beautiful house with good bones and a small studio out back. But for Thomas and Laura, every time the radio played Time in a Bottle, they could still hear it, the faint echo beneath the melody, a second guitar that no one else noticed. And sometimes, in quiet moments, when the world slowed just enough, they could almost feel him there again, sitting by the piano in that cedar house, finally finishing the song he never got to play. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.